Hello and welcome to the Yashi Show podcast. My name is Yasmin Madani and my loved ones call me Yashi, and you can too. I welcome you to join me today for Season 1, Episode 3, which is about people pleasing. Please note that this topic is a two-part series and we are covering Part 2 of people pleasing in this episode. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Part 1 yet, I definitely encourage you to do so. Remember, in this season, which is entitled Who Am I?, we are exploring and asking questions about ourselves and learning to reflect on our behaviors so that we can grow our self-awareness skills. You know what I find to be very tricky about people-pleasing behavior? I feel like over time I easily confused it with simply thinking I was just being nice or just doing something to show kindness for others. When being nice and kind are traits that are preferred and looked upon as good behaviors by other people, it's easy to gravitate towards that. At least that's how it was for me. Being an empath, my focus has always usually been on meeting the needs of others. And it was really challenging for me to begin to acknowledge and learn that I even had my own needs. And beyond that, I was completely oblivious as to what my needs were and how I could even begin to figure out how to do this kind of work within myself. It took several years to figure out how to do this, well into my adult life. Let's begin by starting to learn how to differentiate between these three terms. On the surface, niceness, kindness, and people-pleasing can almost look identical, but if you don't know the difference, you can spend your whole life being good while slowly abandoning yourself. So let's take a closer look. Here's the core difference. Niceness is about being polite, having agreeable behavior, and mostly presents a surface level harmony. Kindness is value-driven care and can include honesty and boundaries. People-pleasing is approval-seeking behavior that is mostly driven by fear. Let's look at an example. Say your manager asks you last minute to stay late one evening at work to help meet some team deadlines. If you're being nice, which is polite and agreeable, you might say, "Sure, no problem." You're being pleasant and cooperative. You might not love it, but you're keeping things smooth. If you want to respond to your manager with kindness, which is value-driven and involves honesty and boundaries, you might say, "I can stay 30 minutes to help, but I have plans after that." In this response, you're helpful and you respect your time. If you're people-pleasing in this instance, your response to your manager is most likely coming from a place of fear. So your immediate response might be, "Of course." And on the inside, you might be feeling exhausted, stressed, and even resentful. But you're afraid of seeming uncommitted, so then you override your limits. Upon self-reflecting, I'm certain many of us can relate to these kinds of experiences. Since I lacked so much self-awareness along the way for so many years, I couldn't fully understand the emotional differences taking place in each of the situations in my life. But when I reflect back now, I see the different patterns that took place with different people over the course of many years. It gives me some perspective. Some of the observations that I've learned about myself along the way include learning to recognize if my response was coming from a place of being polite or just wanting to maintain harmony with the other person. Maybe I was just choosing to be nice in that instance to avoid any discomfort for anyone. It could look like situations when I was just being amicable or neutral around people so that different personalities didn't get triggered. In that instance, I was being nice to keep the peace for everyone. Or if I was genuinely being caring and honest with the other person, like with a close and dear friend whom I could truly be vulnerable with and could express my needs to, then I was showing kindness this way because I was able to consider both our values and needs. Or if I recognize the fear and anxiety in myself when responding to someone because I felt the need to seek approval from that person, then in this instance, I was people pleasing to avoid any discomfort with that particular individual. These types of instances have shown up for me when the other person's approval felt so necessary because it felt like a judgment of my self-worth and was purely based on my role in relationship to that person. When the other person felt like they could control me or my decisions because of their place or position in my life, then that's when it got most challenging for me. Not challenging because I kept having to speak up and use my voice to defend myself, but challenging because I internalized my hurt and silenced my voice. Speaking up takes courage, and I have only found this courage in myself more recently. Hence, a podcast is perfect, don't you think? My main goal with sharing this learning is to create a spark and a hope in yourself. As an educator, this is what my goal essentially always has been with my students, to build genuine connection and to create a spark in them that fosters hope and belief in themselves. And for my listeners that join me on the Yashi Show, do know that I believe in each one of you. As we continue this topic, here's an easy and simple check-in that you can do for yourself if you're not sure. Consider a situation or a conversation with another person when you are responding, and ask yourself these questions. Am I choosing this? Would I still do this if they didn't approve? And am I allowed to say no? If the answer feels free and you can comfortably say no, then it probably has to do with kindness or a healthy niceness. If, however, the answer feels pressured, or if you can't say no without fear or guilt, then that's people pleasing. The key difference between kindness and people pleasing is mainly about intention, choice, and self-respect. They can all look similar on the outside, but feel very different on the inside. Here's the most powerful question that I think you can ask yourself. If they were disappointed, would I still make this choice? I'm going to repeat this question again one more time. If they were disappointed, would I still make this choice? If the answer is yes, that's kindness. If the answer is no, that's likely people pleasing. We can go deeper and deeper into this upon further reflection. And at some point, I'll try and come back to do more of this kind of work in a future podcast. But for now, I want to make a shift. Since this episode is entitled Nice, Nicer, and Burnout, let's talk about the nicer and burnout pieces now. We talked a lot about nice and people pleasing in episode 2, which was last week, which was part 1 of this 2-part series. So in this part 2, let's look at the nicer and burnout pieces now. There's a moment, sometimes very subtle, when being nice turns into being nicer than is necessary. You don't just help, but you overhelp. You don't just listen, you actually absorb. You don't just care, you eventually carry. I think my fellow empaths can relate to this. For example, let's say a friend who is very close to you loses a family member. Their loss is tragic and causes a great deal of trauma for them. You care about your friend so much, so you in some way try to support them at a very deep emotional level, and you actually end up absorbing and carrying some of the grief from their loss. In other situations, it could look something like this. You become the one who stays late at work. You help to mediate every conflict. You remember every birthday. You try to fix every problem, and you never complain. And if you do feel overwhelmed, you tell yourself, it's fine, I can handle it. Being nicer becomes part of your identity. But here's the hard truth that we don't think about. Overfunctioning for everyone else means you're likely underfunctioning for yourself. And I want you to think about that. When you are trying to be there for everyone, when it's beyond your ability to do it, that's probably costing you something, right? So you're over functioning for everyone else and likely under functioning for yourself. The burnout phase, if it happens to you like it did to me, it doesn't usually arrive dramatically. It creeps in. It looks like you have irritability that you can't explain. You have so much exhaustion that you can't even get enough sleep to fix it. You find that you have resentment towards people you love and care about, and you might end up feeling unappreciated, but you can't express yourself and say so. So you're still being nice, but then inside you're tired and you might even have a little bit of anger. And that's quite the paradox here, because the nicer that you are without boundaries, the more invisible your own needs become, even to yourself. And that's probably been one of the biggest realizations that I've made in my self-awareness journey, is that I really didn't ever understand my own needs. But here's what happens. Even if you don't know, eventually your body will know. And that can show up looking like fatigue, headaches, brain fog, anxiety. It's basically kind of like your nervous system is waving a white flag. So it's a huge sign. It's important that we highlight a really important distinction here, I think. People pleasing isn't automatically toxic. In the short term, it can be very adaptive. By that I mean it can reduce immediate conflict, it can help build rapport with others quickly, and it can create safety in unfamiliar environments. It can also buy you time while you assess a situation. So your nervous system sees it as, let's stabilize this moment. Some examples of this include, but are not limited to, being extra agreeable in a new job, or softening your opinion in a very tense moment. And it could also be like letting small things go to preserve that connection with someone you care about. It could be helping your family out even more during a temporary crisis. There's nothing inherently unhealthy about occasionally prioritizing harmony, but the key word is occasionally. In the long term, however, research shows that people-pleasing can become identity eroding. It shifts from adaptive to problematic when people-pleasing becomes your default in almost every interaction, or when you feel anxious at the idea of disappointing someone, maybe when you don't know what you actually want anymore, or when you say yes automatically without even thinking. And when you feel responsible for other people's emotional reactions. Gosh, some of these, if not all of them, are so familiar and extremely relatable for me, and perhaps for you too. Remember, the behavior might look the same externally. However, the difference is internal. In the short term, it's choice, but in the long term, it's compulsion. Try and take some time for yourself to reflect, and maybe journal if that helps you. I always encourage that. And try to reflect on your interactions and about people-pleasing behavior in the short term versus the long term. And really try to look at, are you choosing to accommodate? Are you choosing that? Or do you feel forced to accommodate. So those are two different things. And over time, chronic people pleasing creates much deeper effects because you give, but no one is meeting your needs. And that's partly because you're not expressing your needs. And so over time, resentment builds. When it's chronic, there's also psychological costs such as increased anxiety and stress. There's greater internal conflict and low self trust. You might have difficulty asserting yourself, and you might have emotional exhaustion or burnout, which I've described. And this resentment eventually causes an imbalance in the relationships. So while being helpful and cooperative is healthy, chronic people pleasing, which is driven by fear or insecurity, that's associated with poorer emotional well being over time. And I want you to think of this, okay? I want you to think of this and take a deep breath. I had a listener who said, Yashi, can you do some more deep breaths? So I want to tie that into this episode. So let's take a deep breath, hold it and let it out, okay? Let's take one more deep breath. Try to remember to hold it there. That really helps. That was for my listener who requested it. Thank you. I hope you found it helpful. And the reason that I wanted to put that deep breath here is because now I want you to imagine this, okay? I want you to imagine that you help because you want to, not because you feel obligated. I want you to imagine that you can rest without feeling any guilt. That is such an amazing feeling. We should all be allowed to do that. I want you to think about when you speak, are you rehearsing every sentence and trying to make sure that what you have to say, you say it in a way so that you don't get disapproval? Are you that scared to speak to someone that it makes you have so much anxiety? If you're doing that, imagine not having to do that now, that you can just say what you really want to say and be honest. And then sometimes imagine you don't have the capacity to help someone with their emotions. Let's say it's a family member who you often help soothe if they're upset or angry. And imagine that you can't do it, so you let it go and you let them handle their own emotions this time. And that's okay sometimes, because when we appease and we soothe people who might, not be able to manage their own emotions, then we're not letting them really process what they need to, because they have to learn too to do it for themselves. And we become enablers. Imagine living with somebody who is constantly shouting and screaming and yelling, and that scares you. So then everybody else in the house tries to stay calm. They don't say anything. They try to do whatever that person who's yelling needs, just to keep the peace around the house. But imagine letting them process their own emotions sometimes. I know it can be scary too, but ultimately that's a kind of sustainable kindness, because you are also taking care of yourself. Burnout happens when generosity outruns capacity. So this is what happens. And, if you constantly give in situations where it's never enough and you don't have the capacity to do it and your bucket depletes, then you are going to burn out. And I'm talking immediately from my own experience here. So, and I'm sure others can relate as well. So kindness is when you are also considering yourself. I want to emphasize here before concluding this podcast that the goal isn't to stop caring, okay? It's wonderful to care about others, and We want to care, we want to be empathetic, we want to be loving and nurturing. But what I'm asking you to consider is also to care in a way that includes yourself. I never knew how to do this. So I really urge everyone to think about this and see how you show up for yourself when considering some of these examples. Maybe you'll give you an opportunity to reflect on how you are, and how does self-care look like for you. Is it even showing up for you? And I thank you all for joining me. Feel free to go to my website at theyashishow.com to sign up for my newsletter there. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and also subscribe to The Yashi Show on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Remember, my name is Yashi, and I believe in you. Hope you'll join me again next week on The Yashi Show. Until then, be kind to others, and also remember to be kind to yourself.